Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by OpEdnews.com, available on Pacifica Radio Network, Progressive Radio Network, on iTunes, on Stitcher, on SoundCloud, and at OpEdnews.com/podcasts. My guest for this show is Joshua Frank. He's co-editor of Counterpunch. He's an investigative reporter who's been supported by the Nation Institute, and he's a former writer for OpEd News as well. He has a new book out that he's co-authored with Jeffrey St. Clair, The Big Heat, Earth on the Brink. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Rob.
Oh, it's great to have you here. So tell me what the goal of this book is and what it's about. Let's get the elevator pitch.
Yeah. Well, the book is really a look at the landscape across mostly the United States and other parts of the world of the impact of capitalism, climate change, and on the environment. So we look at its impact on land, water, and we go as far as to look at the impacts of war and what that's doing to areas, particularly in the Middle East, as well as the pollution of the Pentagon's responsible for. But it's really at the heart of it, it's what is happening on the ground day to day for people that are fighting back against this environmental degradation. And we do our best to hold those accountable, the worst of them. So there's a lot of meat in the book. And I think what's nice about the book is that you can pick it up and turn to any page and hopefully be interested in what we're talking about and kind of jump around. So we've had a lot of good feedback about our content in the book. And a lot of the material appeared on Counterpunch previously, but it's always nice to have things in print to reference it. So in a way, it's also a historical document because we trace back through the Obama administration and even before a little bit, all the way through our current administration. And I think for those that can suffer through the whole book, they will see that the arc and the connections are pretty clear, that really the things that we're seeing now are really just an extension of policies that have been in place for years.
Yeah, that was my impression reading the book. You're not very thrilled with Obama, and you basically have a lot of articles describing the problems with him. When we think of Trump, it's like he's bad, but so was Obama.
Well, right, and I think Trump is bad in a different way. He's obviously more egregious. He blatantly says he doesn't believe in science. He has taken a lot of the policies that were put in place under Obama and expanded them. He has rolled back some of the decent things that Obama did. He basically has an all-out war on science, on the EPA in particular. And we're seeing the ramifications of that. But of course, this isn't completely new. And even perhaps more not surprising to some of us is that the Republicans actually are totally in favor of deregulation, of course, and gutting government programs and regulations such as those implemented by the EPA. So what we're seeing now is definitely a wet dream, if you will, of the Republican establishment. And unfortunately, the Democrats, up until this point, has not been pushing back.
Yeah, matter of fact, they just had that new Green New Deal that the centrist neoliberal Democrats who are in charge in the House just blew off.
Right. And then, of course, we have Andrew Wheeler, who's going to likely be the next administrator of the EPA, who is an ex-coal lobbyist. And we're not hearing a huge outcry from the Democrats about that nomination. In fact, it sounds like he's going to go right through with little to no opposition that really matters. So, this is a problem it's a structural problem, and Trump has simply poured fuel on the fire that was already started.
What do you mean structural problem?
Well, of course, when we look at who funds both parties, the fossil fuel industry is handing out money across the board. We can look at the Obama administration in particular. What happened? We saw increase in fracking for the first time. We became, in 60 years, we were finally again exporting oil, largely because of the fracking industry and what was happening in the Bakken region of North Dakota. We often think of fracking as being natural gas, but in the case of North Dakota, it's actually fracking for oil. But of course, we saw a big boom in natural gas as well under Obama. So while he talked tough on these climate accord agreements and climate change, his policies on the ground would have us believe otherwise, that we in fact were exporting our fossil fuels for other countries to burn. And of course, as we know, CO2 and methane emissions, doesn't matter what country's emitting them, it's a global phenomenon, a global problem. So we're only seeing an extension of that under Trump, of course, and he has blatantly said he wants to resurrect the coal industry, which likely won't happen. But at the same time, fracking is going strong, and Trump has pushed for offshore drilling across the country. And he's also planning on opening up the Anwar area of Alaska, which has been the forefront of environmental battles for decades. So we're seeing this war continue, but it didn't start with Trump, that's for sure.
I kind of think the difference is Obama allowed a lot to happen, was weak on regulations. Trump is an outright environmental rapist.
Yeah, that's a very good way of looking at it. But it's also, what form of murder are we privy to? I think at the end of the day, what we really need to look at are the numbers, and what the numbers I'm talking about are the CO2 emissions and methane emissions globally. And we didn't see the United States roll back dramatically its own emissions. We are far off our own modest goals way before Trump was in office. So, this is a problem that transcends political parties.
Yeah, that's part of the problem. There aren't, when it comes to some of these issues, there's hardly any difference.
That's true. But it's not to say that there aren't differences. There certainly are differences. It's just that the differences are minuscule enough that they don't always make that big of a difference when it comes to the environment, particularly. But we did see some hopeful signs during the Obama administration, but they didn't come from the administration itself. They came from people that were fighting back, particularly the pipeline protests in North Dakota.
Now, you talk about that. You describe Standing Rock as the greatest uprising against the American fossil fuel industry.
Definitely in the present era, there is no question that was by far the biggest grassroots effort that galvanized people globally, because it was an indigenous movement as well. And I think there was a lot of strength that we could glean from that movement. And I think that it hasn't ended. It's continuing, and I think that's a hopeful sign, if we can even talk about such thing as hope in this kind of era. But if at the very least, it's invigorating. And I think what it shows us is that we shouldn't rely on the big green organizations like the Sierra Club and Nrdc and these other big outfits that are seemingly more interested in fundraising than they are in actual action. That's not to say there aren't great people working for these organizations. There are, but they are not as effective, I would argue, on the radical front, on pushing the needle forward to fight on the ground, and really it has to be a militant actions that are going to, at the end of the day, make an impact and scare big oil. We can fight them in the courts, we can fight them all over the board, but when it comes to actually laying pipeline, for example, and blocking those pipelines, that's where you can make a real impact.
So what is the value of the Sierra Club and the NRDC? What do they do that is beneficial?
Well, they put out a lot of great reports. They have a lot of money and a lot of researchers doing a lot of things. So we do end up finding out a lot of information. Of course, the government does a lot of that as well. And I would argue, actually, the Sierra Club, which I've been a part, not necessarily working for directly, but I've worked on projects that they were involved in over the years. And I would argue that actually the Sierra Club they've been doing some pretty good work in other countries, particularly India on coal issues and some other cases. But locally, Sierra Club feels good. You might sign a petition here and there. But ultimately, I don't see a lot of actions from them directly. So there might be some local chapters and some hiking clubs and things like that to get people outdoors, which are great. But as far as environmental action, I wouldn't put your minimal resources into the Sierra Club.
Well, like you said, you see the need for more radical responses, more militant responses. What do they look like?
Well, I think Standing Rock is a perfect example of what a militant action looks like. We write about other radicals in our book that have been deemed terrorists by the FBI and what their actions looked like. Most of them were nonviolent. Some of them, obviously, we don't necessarily agree with, but being labeled a terrorist for burning down a genetically engineered laboratory that studies, GMO trees, for example, isn't necessarily a terrorist act. People weren't targeted. That doesn't mean that was the right action. But I think we're likely to see more and more of those types of actions taking place as climate change continues to rear its ugly head. And we're already seeing the impacts of climate change and global warming. And I would argue, as Ralph Nader says, we shouldn't be calling it climate change. We should call it something else like climate catastrophe, or something that actually reflects how dire the situation really is. So I have to work on my own vernacular and call it something different. But ultimately, we're seeing the impacts of this across, no matter where you live anymore, we're seeing these impacts. So I think we're going to start seeing, since those impacts are impacting people locally in their own backyards, we're going to see more and more actions locally as well. I think people are going to start waking up. And we're seeing that on both sides of the political spectrum, that it doesn't matter if you're a right-wing conservative. If you're in a flood zone, you might start thinking twice about the carbon emissions that are happening in your state. You might try to fight back against the coal industry in your state or against the natural gas industry. And you might not, but I think, sometimes there's enough of us out there that know what's going on, that we're going to see more and more action on the ground.
I know Will Potter, who does a lot of writing about environmental issues. He's written about this whole idea of how green is the new red. He wrote a book by that title.
Yeah.
Where basically environmentalists are being characterized as terrorists if they protest, if they go somewhere and shoot video even. So
right.
There's a danger in that there is some legislation out there at state and federal levels that literally characterizes protests relating to the environment or to farming as a crime, as terrorism.
That's right. But I would also argue, and I think Will would as well, that just shows you that those types of actions have impact. The government wouldn't be as concerned about those types of actions if they were meaningless or they didn't have some kind of ramifications attached to them. Of course, we should fight back and really against this terrorism label. But the actions themselves, in many cases, are I would argue, a legitimate response to our dire situation.
Interesting. So when legislation is passed to restrict Fourth Amendment and First Amendment rights, look at it as a sign of success of protests.
Well, anytime they're scared of something, we're doing something right.
Yeah. Okay. So You get into storytelling in this book.
Mm-hmm.
You go into detail describing some of the people who are standing up and who are being accused of being environmental terrorists. Can you tell us a story?
Sure. One story that we write about is a lady called Brianna Waters. She got wrapped up in a pretty interesting case at the University of Washington, where a group of individuals went in and burned down a laboratory, a science building, essentially, not the whole building, but a portion of it, where research was taking place, or at least they thought research was taking place on genetically modified trees. And the long story is that she was caught up in this, labeled a terrorist. Her role was very minimal, but she was facing a very severe sentence.
What?
So the story isn't so much about the action itself, but it's about the government's response to that action, and also what it did to the Earth Liberation Front individuals that were involved in it, and how they turned on each other, and how the FBI infiltrated to essentially entrap some of them, which they were successful at, which the FBI has been successful at for a long time. And just the reaction.
Tell us a little more about that. Tell us about the FBI entrapment and how the ELF turned on each other.
Well, that's a long story, but essentially one of the main things that they did was find an individual that was addicted to methamphetamines or heroin, and that was friends with a lot of these people that were involved in these actions, and they essentially paid him to become an informant. That informant, in turn, went all over the country and infiltrated, or at least went to meetings, met with people, stayed in people's homes, people that were his friends, people that wanted to help him. And some of the information that he got from those encounters were in turn used by the FBI to file lawsuits, to arrest people. Indictments were flying left and right. And in many cases, those accusations were essentially hearsay, because this individual wasn't even involved in a lot of these actions that people were supposedly talking about. But at the end of the day, what we were seeing was a lot of resources put forward by the FBI to infiltrate and to break up these organizations because they saw them as such a threat. But ultimately, I would argue that many of these actions didn't actually work out very well. Some of them were planned pretty poorly. And you may remember some of these actions. A lot of them were taking place in the late 90s, early 2000s, primarily in California and Oregon, parts of Washington in some cases, and also ski resort in Colorado. There were instances where these individuals were lighting things on fire, burning down new development, and those sorts of things. And Jeffrey and I definitely are not advocating arson as a legitimate and impactful action. But I think we would both agree that those types of actions are a response that is worthy of debate when it comes to our situation. But you can have militant action and action that involves more and more people across the economic spectrum, across the globe. I think Standing Rock's a perfect example where violence wasn't necessarily a part of the action, but the action was impactful. And again, talking about infiltration, the Standing Rock movement was infiltrated as well, which we write about in the book.
I asked you to talk about infiltration. So talk about infiltration in Standing Rock. But wait, first a brief show ID. This is the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, and I'm going to just pause for about 10 seconds so I can find the spot on the audio so I can edit in a bumper. And my guest for this show is Joshua Frank. He's co-editor of Counterpunch, an investigative reporter supported by the Nation Institute, and a former writer for OpEdnews.com. So you're going to tell us about how the FBI basically got into Standing Rock and infiltrated them.
Well, in the case of Standing Rock, it was not the FBI, but it was, in one case, it was the Indiana Department of Homeland Security. And there was been some FOIA requests by, I believe, journalist Mike Best. And he was able to uncover a few instances where law enforcement had infiltrated both, I guess, mainly the people in Standing Rock in this case, but I think he uncovered primarily the Ohio State Highway Patrol was involved, as well as Indiana, which is interesting given the fact that the protests were taking place in North Dakota, right?
Yeah.
But they were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars. These dollars obviously were stemming from Homeland Security funds at the federal level, so it's all connected. But they were essentially well armed, not only infiltrated, but they were reacting to the protests as if the protest was a military action. These Homeland Security officers and deputies, the ones that weren't infiltrating but were fighting back against the protest, were very well armed. Essentially, they had riot gear, shotguns, night vision goggles. They had a lot of things that you would think might be something that that the Israeli military has on the border of Gaza. But this is happening right in our backyard in North Dakota. And of course, the Standing Rock protesters were not armed, but they were faced with a military reaction. But of course, this is something that anybody that's been involved in any kind of action or protest at that kind of level has experienced, whether it was the WTO protests in Seattle or in '99, which I was at and Jeffrey was at. It was my first taste of tear gas, and I think that's the typical reaction these days is a police-military crackdown of protests, and Standing Rock was a perfect example of that.
My first taste of tear gas was 1970-71, Vietnam War protests. And nowadays, they really don't use as much tear gas, right?
No, they have other ways of halting a protest than tear gas, but it's still definitely used. They use these pepper ball launchers now that are pretty effective.
That's what they're using now.
Yeah.
So,
which I would add, we're paying for. These are tax dollars being used to, fund these essential military operations.
And you left out Occupy, of course. Occupy, sure. I believe that we've learned that Occupy, through the instigation of Obama, was thoroughly infiltrated, and the difference was that more recently they have these multi-department centers where they integrate Homeland Security with police and military and the FBI, and it's much worse.
Oh, absolutely. And again, I think that just shows the effectiveness that Occupy had. Had Occupy not been a threat to the establishment, to Wall Street, you would not have seen that kind of reaction.
Yeah.
You don't see a lot of paramilitary troops out during a sidewalk protest put on by the Sierra Club, and that's for a reason.
Yeah. Now, you say in the book, you talk about what it means to be an environmentalist in the late stages of capitalism. So that raises a couple of questions. What do you mean? What do you mean late stages of capitalism?
Well, there's obviously a branch of thought that argues that capitalism can't continue on its current trajectory without having really dire circumstances.
Now, when you say that, it makes me think of the allegory of the frog and the scorpion. You know, the scorpion says, "You're going to cross the river. Please help me go across." And the frog says, "I can't. You'll kill me." And the scorpion goes, "Oh, no, I'm going to be really good. I won't. I promise." And the frog goes, "Well, if you really promise, okay." They get to the middle of the river, and the scorpion stabs him, and they die. And as they're dying, the frog says, you promised me. Why did you do that?" And the scorpion goes, "Because it's my nature."
Right.
And really, capitalism's nature is self-destructive, at least the predatory kind that we have right now.
Well, and I would argue, I don't know what that different kind exists. And this form of capitalism that we're living under is propped up, and the backbone of that is the fossil fuel industry. We could not operate a global market without the use of fossil fuels, whether it's the products being made and power being produced in those manufacturing plants, to the ships that are coming across from Southeast Asia, to our own backyard, to the manufacturing of vehicles and what the impact of cars have on our environment. Every stage of the market, fossil fuels are involved in it. Whether it's the plastics that are in the products to the energy that produce those products. So it's integral in capitalism. And of course, we're seeing the impacts of that. We're seeing the impact of fossil fuel industry run amok that is not regulated globally. And those impacts are pretty frightening for those that are paying attention. Of course, I think it's in human nature to perhaps, I don't want to say ignore the truth, but to push it aside a little bit so that we aren't super depressed. Because it's pretty easy to read the reports, even the modest ones that are coming out of our own government, about how dire the situation really is and what we can expect in the near future. And if we focus on that, it's easy to give up. But as we argue in the book, there's a lot to keep fighting for. There's still grizzly bears out there, and they need us. There's still wild animals all over the planet that need protection and need our help, and are suffering not only because of climate change, but because of poaching and other issues and loss of land in particular. So there's still a lot of things worth fighting for. And then, of course, we're adherents of Ed Abbey, in the sense that we enjoy getting out in nature. We enjoy getting out in the wild. There's still rivers to raft. There's still mountains to climb. There's still, community gardens to tend to. We're advocates of getting our shoes dirty and getting in the mud a little bit. And I think the more people do that, the more respect they gain for nature, and the more willing their fight to preserve it. Which might be a Sierra Club motto as well.
and really,
I happen to agree with.
That has nothing to do with climate change, really. Those issues,
right?
I mean, they're the kinds that conservatives used to get behind 100%. The idea of conservation. That's
sure.
Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah. Those aren't radical. The Nature Conservancy, for example, which owns a ton of land. And in fact, I was just on some of their land out in the Channel Islands off the coast of Southern California, where I live. And, they are doing decent things, but the people that are in charge of that property and that land are actually Republicans. They're conservative people that want to maintain a semblance of how it used to be. And in many ways, I have this conversation often. I grew up in Montana. I have a lot of relatives and friends who still live there, and it's a conservative environment. And we happen to agree on how important it is to protect our wild and natural resources. And in a place like Montana, of course, it's long been a boondoggle for the fossil fuel industry, and for the resource extraction industry in particular. And people are seeing the impacts of that. People on all sides of the political spectrum, I think, are realizing the importance of protecting the heritage of a place, which means protecting its biodiversity. And so it's getting to the point where any large
any large mammal, I said land, but it certainly includes sea mammals too, are endangered.
That's right. And I think people, even though they may never see a dolphin off the coast of Japan, they understand the importance of trying to fight those that are harvesting dolphins, for example. Or, they may be supporting Sea Shepherd and their actions in the South Pacific to directly fight against the Japanese whaling operations. And I think that's a grander sort of notion that people have about protecting that which is greater than us and special. And of course, I don't know anybody that would argue that a whale isn't a beautiful creature and worthy of protection. And those that are people that probably wouldn't have a beer with. But there's most of us would agree that those are important things to preserve and to protect, because they are, precious beings that are sentient and able of having feelings and families, just like we are as humans.
I grit my teeth, as you said. I wouldn't have a beer with those people, and I think they are horrible, disgusting, probably narcissistic shadows of what it is to be human, if they don't have compassion for those noble creatures that are so separate from us. It should be one of humanity's great values. Just like you don't take a dump in public, you don't disrespect, you don't not value creatures like that. And we need to change our value system to reflect that, really.
Absolutely. And we know once those species are gone, they may never come back. In most cases, they will never come back.
Right.
And certainly if they're come back, in the case of wolves in parts of, Montana and other Oregon now, they're all over in certain areas. They're not the traditional, they're not the native species. And of course, when it comes to whales and sea mammals, that's never, once they're gone forever, and there's no coming back. And of course, the ocean and our impacts on the ocean are tantamount, and we write about that pretty extensively in the book.
You talk in the book about privatization of wildlife too.
Yeah, I have a piece in the book about Yellowstone's bison and how Ted Turner was able to get some of these bison and start reproducing them for his own greed, which ends up being meat in his case. But the case of Yellowstone is a very interesting one. This is of the lower 48. It's the most wild area we have still left, biodiversity wise, genetically, for the species that live there. It's almost as if it was the same as it was 100 years ago, which is pretty rare these days. But of course, the grizzly bears that roam out of the park's boundaries and the bison that roam out of the park's boundaries, they don't know that they're leaving the park. And when they do, they lose protections. And in the case of grizzlies, now they're going to be hunted for sport because they've, quote unquote, no longer endangered. Of course, that's arbitrary numbers that are placed on them by people, and not historic numbers. And of course, then we're not taking into account why they're leaving the park like they haven't in the past. And primarily it's for food, because food is more and more scarce because of the impacts of climate change in particular. So, but in the case of the bison, it's the same issue. Bison leaving the park and being slaughtered. And in the case of Ted Turner, he was able to get some of these to, in his mind, perhaps save them, but ultimately it's their own demise.
And that also involved ranchers around and near Yellowstone.
Well, right, and that's the case that they argue that the bison carry a disease that will impact their herds of cattle, even though there's been no cases of that ever happening. The ranchers, of course, in places like Wyoming and Montana have a lot of power politically, and they are direct opposition of buffalo being reintroduced to the range.
Why?
because they're afraid that those buffalo carry disease, and those diseases could get into their cattle and kill their cattle and impact their profit margin, even though that's never been the case.
But in your book, you talk about how Ted Turner's bison or buffalo developed anthrax.
That's right. Yeah. And in fact, the wild buffalo, as far as I know, have a much less chance of having some of those diseases than the ones that are kept in captivity and bred to become a meat that Ted Turner, for instance, is selling in his stores, or his products that he produces.
It's terrible.
But it's worth fighting for, right? I mean, that's the bottom line is these animals still exist. They're still out there. They still need our help. They still need our protection. And we can get caught up in the horrificness of climate change, for example, or global warming. But ultimately, there's plenty to continue to fight for. And you can ask anybody that works at the Buffalo Field Campaign, which I'm a big supporter of. They're based right in West Yellowstone, and they monitor the buffalo. They work to protect the buffalo. They have actions on all levels. And these are small little groups that a lot of people don't know about, and we do try to highlight those in our book.
Now, tell us a little bit about them.
Well, the Buffalo Field Campaign is a pretty small outfit. They thrive on volunteers. They go out in the early to late fall to monitor buffalo migration patterns. So a lot of what we know about the bison in Yellowstone is coming from these people that are working on the ground, and they're the ones that are fighting the ranchers that want them killed. They're the ones that are working to make sure that the Yellowstone bison are protected. And that's what their sole purpose is, and they're pretty darn effective at it.
What else can people do? What else can listeners do, viewers do, to help with not just the bison, but all the problems that you're exploring in this book? How can they take action?
Well, sometimes the actions don't have to be large and grandiose. I think that sometimes the actions are things that are a lot closer to home. I think that it's really important, for instance, to support local farmers, to try to buy organic when possible, to get involved in food cooperatives at the local level. Those are very, very important things. Our food supply system is something that we have a direct impact with, and that we're involved with daily. Of course.
Now that resonates. I call the show the Bottom Up Show, and what you're talking about is a bottom up approach to food and consumerism, really.
Absolutely, and I think it's a radical notion that undermines the tenets of capitalism, right? If we take that into our own hands, we are subverting the market. In the case of the food cooperative, a lot of the original food cooperatives, especially in the New England area and where you are perhaps as well, were co-ops where people would grow their own food, go to a place and trade. There was in the early days of food cooperatives, there wasn't even money exchanged. It was simply a bartering system, and that's the direct conflict to capitalism. And of course, I wish that there was food cooperatives all over the place. But it's a lot easier to have them in some places and not others, particularly in urban areas. But again, at the local level in urban areas, there's community gardens, and I think that's a very important place for people to start and to get out there, get their hands dirty, plant some food. And there's nothing, I don't think, there's more gratifying than eating food that you grew for dinner and sharing it with your friends. It's a pretty powerful thing. So those are small actions that. And
along those lines, there are other things you can do too. You want to try to buy local, and as much as you can, identify local stores to buy in. If you're going to a franchise, find ones that have local owners. Even if you're buying on Amazon, a lot of the sellers on Amazon can be individuals or small businesses. So try to buy, if you're going to Amazon, from small sellers rather than Amazon brands or directly from Amazon.
Yeah, and if they want to buy our book, The Big Heat, go to counterpunch.org and get it from us directly. That's a good way to do it as well. You can bypass Amazon altogether.
There you go.
But another thing that people can do locally is transportation related. Of course, this is we need to get out of our vehicles when possible and start walking and pushing for safe bike lanes in cities and obviously public transportation. Those at the local level, those make a big impact. And the less money we're putting into the pockets of the fossil fuel industry, the more we can put back into our own communities, right? And maybe it'll just be, riding your bike to the grocery store once or twice a week or to your local pub, whatever it might be. Those, instead of driving, it's a very good alternative.
And when you think about long distance food, think about oil in your food, because really that's what's happening. If your food is being brought in by truck or rail or by ship, it's got oil in it. And you want to try to get as much local as you possibly can.
That's right. And that requires turning over the package and reading, its origin. I was actually in Whole Foods recently and was looking at some frozen vegetables just because they were on sale. And guess where they were produced? In China. No, we should not be buying broccoli from China.
Yeah.
Especially in a place like California where we have abundant agriculture industry.
And with globalization, it's just as likely that the Chinese are buying broccoli from the United States too.
Pretty soon they're going to be buying soybeans from Russia, right? It's this intercontinental commerce has a big impact on our global climate. There's no question about it, and capitalism is the backbone of that.
Yeah, so let me just do another show ID. This is the Rob Cole Show. I'm going to just pause for a minute and have a little silence. Oh, good. We got another voice in this. Oh.
Yeah. Can you go lay down? Go on. Think she heard me talking about food.
I still got to do the pause, though, so just give a second.
Yeah, no problem.
And my guest for this show is Joshua Frank. He's co-editor of Counterpunch. He's an investigative reporter supported by the Nation Institute. He's a former writer for OpEdnews.com. And he's the co-author of a new book with Jeffrey St. Clair, The Big Heat, Earth on the Brink. So let's talk about the FBI's Operation Backfire. That's something you discuss in your book at length.
Yeah. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, this infiltration by the FBI into the radical environmental movement was called Operation Backfire. Now, I think one of the most interesting things about Operation Backfire wasn't necessarily its tactics, because they weren't new tactics. It was the way in which they deemed a non-violent, or in the case of arson of the Earth Liberation Front, individuals that weren't targeting people in their actions, right? They were targeting, some cases, institutions, but primarily they were targeting structures and buildings. They were burning down buildings, and in other cases they were releasing wildlife from captivity. But they never were going after human beings. And in fact, in every single case, they made very cautious decisions so that human life wasn't impacted by their actions. Yet, they still were deemed the #1 domestic terrorist organization in the country at the time. That tells you something about the priorities of the FBI, right? That a group of individuals that had never harmed one person, in fact, their intention was never to harm someone, could be deemed a terrorist. That's pretty astounding, I think, from any level, right? That somehow these individuals were more dangerous than Timothy McVeigh was.
No, I have to say, though, that violence of any kind is not, I don't think, the right way to engage in activism. I think it's a mistake. Their intention is noble, but I think that kind of activity, destruction of property, is a mistake. I think it hurts the movement overall. And
sure, yeah, and I tend to agree with you. However, I still would argue that these individuals were not terrorists, right? By labeling them terrorists, the FBI was able to put a lot of resources into fracturing the movement. And
probably engaging in all kinds of judicially authorized spying on them.
Oh, absolutely. But the real danger is that once they were able to label that particular group as a terrorist organization, it then impacted a lot of radical environmentalists that weren't involved in violent protests, right? That then pretty soon they could be deemed a terrorist as well, even though they were never involved in any of this stuff. So it became a very slippery slope and impacted a lot of people that were never involved in any direct action violently, never in any kind of arson or anything like that. But pretty soon, people that were climbing redwoods and protesting, forest practices in the Pacific Northwest and Northern California were starting to be deemed as a terrorists. So that was the danger of that. But I agree with you about, arson as a legitimate form of protest. I think it's a legitimate form of protest. I just don't think it's an effective one.
I think another thing, while we were talking before about what things that individuals can do, is just eat less meat. That's such a simple
certainly.
thing to do.
Certainly. The food we consume in the meat industry is obviously a huge contributor to climate change. The methane alone that is released from cows is exponential. Not to mention the deforestation it's taking in places like Brazil to grow soy in certain cases to feed the cattle industry, and a lot of that cattle is ending up in North America. It's a horrible industry that anybody in the right mind should step back from and think twice about consuming.
Well, I've tried to be a vegan or a vegetarian, and I can't do it. I've tried. But
well, I mean, being a vegan isn't necessarily the answer either. I mean, there are a lot of products, for instance, if we're talking about food, and I spent many years actually managing a food cooperative in upstate New York, or being a part-time manager, I should say. And I had these debates a lot with people that were vegans, that they were buying fake meat products that were produced in Thailand and elsewhere. That the carbon footprint of that was still really, really high. You'd be better off eating locally produced eggs from a local farmer, if you're thinking about your CO2 footprint. So it's not, it's not black and white when it comes to food. I think, as we were talking about, it's much more important to eat locally and to try to not eat food that's produced on a mass scale.
And the other thing, in terms of not being a vegetarian or vegan, is you can just cut back on the meat you eat. For me, if I eat two or three meat meals in a short time period, I'm going to make an effort to have a vegan meal or two or three, or a whole vegan day. And you don't have to go vegan to cut back on your intake. And that's a way that you can make a difference without having to give up your meat.
Well, and for those that do eat meat, I would argue that I hope that they also choose to eat meat that is produced as ethically as possible. And sometimes that means spending more money, but it's not only better for the animals while they're alive, it's also better for our health if we're not eating products that are laden with pesticides or hormones in the case of meat.
And it's getting easier to do that. You can go to many more grocery stores now, and find organic and cage-free kinds of food, and uh, it just is easier to do now.
It is. And of course, there's a lot of confusion with those types of labels. And it's really, really important that people catch up on what their local ordinance state laws are when it comes to, production of food and eggs in particular and labeling, because it's not always what we think it is.
But tell me about it. What about eggs? What do I need to know?
Well, I don't know what the laws are in Pennsylvania, but I know in California, for instance, something can say, cage-free, but in fact, hens are packed tightly into a warehouse where disease is easily spread and their living conditions aren't very good at all. So it's almost a marketing ploy in the case of eggs out here in California. But I think in some cases it's moving in the right direction. And you just have to pay a little bit more to get the ones that might say free range, organic, locally produced in those cases, or just stay away from them altogether, right? If that's the case. But every state has different laws in place, which means different labeling practices.
Yeah, it's tough. It's a hard thing to do, but it's worth doing. And because it's not just about the ethics, it's also about the health. If you're buying non-organic food, you're probably getting a lot more drugs and hormones in it than you would otherwise, too.
That's right. Yeah, so certainly. And I mean, it's a pretty safe bet to just steer clear of food that's not grown in our own country.
There you go. Because of all the oil that it has in it, too.
Right.
So another topic that you cover in the book is the role of war and its effect on the environment.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about that.
Well, it's we often, especially those of us that are on the left that oppose war, we often talk about its impact on civilians and the civilian populations. But we rarely talk about what its impact might be on the environment. We have an essay in the book about what the bombing in Afghanistan has done to bird migration patterns, to perhaps to the snow leopard, which is a very rare endangered species, in the areas that the Taliban and back when we were hunting bin Laden was allegedly hiding out. We were bombing ruthlessly, which is a very, very delicate biological area for the snow leopard and other creatures. And a lot of these impacts that we have from our bombing campaigns on the environment are not known. We don't really actually have any hard data on what the impact has been. And it's just something that we don't often address in the anti-war movement, is what our warfare of blowing things up actually does locally to the environment, whether it's to polluting water supplies, the groundwater supplies, rivers, to what it's doing to the animals that are on the receiving end of our bombs.
What about the lobbyists, the military-industrial complex lobbyists? What effects do they have on the environment indirectly?
Well, I mean, these individuals are the proponents of endless war. They're the ones that don't want us to pull our troops out of Afghanistan or Syria or Iraq because it's a money-making operation, as we know, and it's perpetual war for perpetual nonsense, right? But its impact is very, very great. The more bombs that they drop, the more impact on the people that live there and the natural landscape itself. But also it lines their pockets. The more bombs we drop, the more money they make.
I mean, but I would imagine that if we had $1 trillion a year, which is what we spend on our military and the Defense Department indirectly,
mm-hmm.
we could do an awful lot of good for the environment and an awful lot of spending that could protect animals, protect the environment, and change our relationship to nature. I mean, so it's not just
Certainly.
Bombs and how they affect things. It goes way back, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
National priorities.
That's right. Yeah, and not to mention what the manufacturing of weapons does to our local environment, whether it's nuclear issues that are happening in Hanford right now, where we used to produce plutonium for atomic weapons, and the ongoing crisis there that is threatening the Columbia River, and consequently not only the fish in that river, but the farmers that are irrigating the waters from the Columbia. And it's the number one nuclear site in the world. That's the most toxic nuclear site in the world, arguably, and certainly in North America. And it's billions and billions of dollars of our taxpayer dollars are going to remedy it and to clean it up. But there's been very little progress over the last few decades.
Now, we've only got a minute or two left. I wanted to talk a little bit about Counterpunch. Tell us about Counterpunch.
Well, for those that aren't familiar with Counterpunch, we are a website. You can find us at counterpunch.org. And we
Great site.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, we update the site almost daily. We take weekends off, but we have new material up 5 days a week. And we also we have a print magazine, which also is in digital format, that comes out bi-monthly. And I believe it's almost 30 pages long now, so it's a pretty good read. And then we also have a publishing wing, and we publish books and distribute books with the help of AK Press. And any day that you go there, you'll see a range of articles from things related to the environment to obviously to our crazy president to the economic crisis that's looming. We have a lot of different information, and we're sure to have material that people agree with and make you think, and certainly things that you might not agree with. But that's what makes this a fun place to come and punch it out.
You've got a great team of writers there too.
Yeah, we're really happy with our family of writers, and we do feel like we are a family of writers. There's we publish probably 500 different authors a year. So we have a wide range of voices on Counterpunch.
Absolutely. And we've got a wrap. This has been the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. And my guest for this show has been Joshua Frank, the co-editor of Counterpunch and the co-author of the new book, The Big Heat, Earth on the Brink. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Rob.